Good morning. I'm Harley Schlanger from the LaRouche organization with your daily update for January 19th, 2021. I think it's an understatement to say there's a great deal of tension in the United States on the eve of the inauguration of Joseph Biden as president, which takes place on January 20th. There are troops in Washington, D.C. There are still reports of armed militia marching in state capitals, potential for violence in Washington, D.C., which has been built up by the opponents of Trump, who are basically claiming that anyone who opposed Biden or who claimed there was vote fraud are potential terrorists who have to be dealt with decisively and effectively. Now, as it stands, tens of millions of people still believe that the election was rigged and there never was an adequate investigation. So this is increasing the tension. The impeachment of Trump by the House last week following the riot outside inside the Capitol building, all of this has brought the country to a fevered pitch. Now, I want to address a couple of things that look beyond tomorrow at the fights ahead. But let me start with something that gives you an indication of why this Wall Street, Silicon Valley, City of London crowd was so desperate to carry out the removal of Donald Trump from president. And that is a new Office of the Comptroller of Currency rule that Trump has supported called the Fair Access to Financial Services. And this prohibits the redlining of companies or funds which invest in energy technologies, in agriculture or ranching, or in arms and armaments. In other words, goods production. There's a part of the Great Reset which is an explicit rejection of goods production because of the so-called carbon footprint that it would leave. And according to the fake science of the global warming, man-made global warming crowd, the carbon footprint is responsible for the heating up of the climate. And therefore, banks must join with every other institution in shutting down goods production that leaves a carbon footprint. Now, this ruling by the Office of Comptroller of the Currency would prohibit the establishment of a banking compact, which has already been signed, organized by Mark Carney, formerly of the Bank of England, that 130 banks as of last year, maybe many more now, have agreed to cut lending to any company engaged in goods production. So this ruling is an explicit slap in the face to the Davos crowd, to BlackRock and Carney and their Green New Deal, because it would make illegal what they're intending to do. Now, this agreement for a compact to restrict lending is a frontal assault on production in favor of inefficient energy and primitive and sustainable agriculture. To give you a sense of how hysterical they are, 3 days in a row, the Journal of the American Banking Association attacked this ruling, and also CNBC, which unfortunately many people turn to for business news, has also come out against it. Now remember, the plan of the Green New Deal is to shut down oil and natural gas usage, coal production, and nuclear power, and replace it with wind and solar farms, as well as eliminate the use of fertilizers and pesticides, and culling herds of livestock, all of which would create a global food crisis. Now this is part of the Great Reset that the Biden team supports, which the European Union is supporting, and which is being organized by all the central banks, the Federal Reserve, Bank of England, European Central Bank, and so on. And the intention of this is to establish a top-down control over spending of every country, which would be the final elimination of sovereignty, the idea of the sovereign nation state. So that's why this crowd, the Davos crowd, Silicon Valley, with its censorship, the Wall Street, City of London crowd, why they've been so insistent that Trump must go, and any American that believes in the idea of national sovereignty is a potential terrorist. So this is part of the reason why there's so much tension as we come up to January 20th. Now, adding to this was a ruling by the European Commission, or I should say a document, which is being released today, which calls for the promotion of the euro as a replacement of the dollar. It's not quite that explicit, but they're basically saying there must be more widespread use of the euro. They're calling for fostering the euro's status as the international reference currency in trade, energy, and commodity sectors, including, of course, the funny money derivative sectors. And it also then calls for the strengthening of the sanctions policy, which the EU has joined Washington in supporting. It also calls for the completion of the European Union banking union, under which all European banks would submit to the authority of Brussels. So this is totally coherent with the Great Reset and the Green New Deal. Now, as this is happening, the euro is appreciating against the dollar. The euro has gone up 10% against the dollar in the last month. The dollar is at a 2-year low compared to the euro. Now, what's the talk in Europe right now? I mean, here you have a continent which is stricken by a continuation of the COVID pandemic, which has lockdowns in many countries, hospitals overcrowded, governments talking about more harsh restrictions on movement, as here in Germany we see. And while this is going on, they're threatening more cutback of manufacturing with the Green Deal of the European Union. And there'll be energy shortages, with Germany having an exit from nuclear, exit from coal, and reliance increasingly on inefficient sources such as wind and solar. How is this going to lead to a rising up of Europe against the United States? But that's exactly what the governments of Europe are talking about, that there's a European recovery which is non-existent, which will make Europe the strongest financial power in the world. Now, with the energy shortage, the credit shutdown, and carbon taxes, how will that happen? The assault on the auto sector in Europe is threatening close to 1 million productive jobs in Germany. Then you add to that the collapse of the production in the United States, which is playing a leading role in the drop of the dollar, and the flood of funny money from the Federal Reserve, which is threatening a hyperinflation. And what we can see is that we're facing very deep and disturbing economic trends, which threaten the lives of everyone on the planet. And the idea that the Davos billionaires can somehow weather this storm is completely unrealistic and probably impossible. So what does this mean? It means the big fight ahead is going to be that between the true revival of the American system, which President Trump called for in his election and in his first year in office, the fulfilling that pledge in the weeks and months ahead, against a Congress which is committed to policies which will shut down physical economy on behalf of a British speculative system, a funny money system, and a global bankers' dictatorship. So this is the fight we're coming up to. I would encourage you, stick with the LaRouche Organization website, where we'll have constant updates on this fight, including on what's happening with the real economy. So that's my update for today. I'll see you again tomorrow.